Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first instalment of a four-part series leading up to the Vitality Women's FA Cup final. The focus of this webinar is in possession, specifically on finishing and the considerations we have for practice design. My name is Simon Houston, a Games Insight Analyst at the FA, and I'm delighted to be joined by Kelsey Byrne on the call, who is a Women's National Coach Developer. Also, we've got Adam Dunleavy, who is one of our Women's High Performance Centre Coach Development Officers. We've also got Suey Smith in the background dealing with any questions in the public chat. So please feel free to interact with Suey and the questions she'll be popping in on certain slides. So without further ado, we'll get started. So we thought we'd set out three main webinar outcomes from the offset and then try and have them as a thread all the way through the webinar for the evening. So the first one is a large part of the webinar this evening is going to be presenting some WSL data from the goals of the WSL season last season. So it's a recent study that we've only just completed, and this data hasn't been seen before. It's new data and hopefully relevant to yourselves on the call and practice design within your clubs. Kelsey, I'm just going to bring you in for the final two outcomes.
Yeah, no problem. And I suppose sort of introducing really that my part within supporting you guys was to bring a coaching edge to the data really. And to support with the data collection and just to start to think about trying to understand the landscape of the women's game. And I suppose that our professional league hasn't been adopted for that long. So we wanted to really unpick what the landscape of the game actually looked like, especially in this final third area, as it's an area of focus for our national teams really moving forward. So the second point was about identifying those key messages. What did we find in the data? What can we utilise? And what's the implications on practice design? This one in particular with a focus on the technical proficiency and some technical action. And then the last point really was around considering how to actually utilise those key messages. So, okay, we've got them and we've found them. We know the implications. How do I now apply that to a practice and apply that when designing practices to ensure that the practice actually replicates the game demands for players? And we're going to utilise Everton and Man City, obviously being the finalists in the FA Cup, to help us bring that to life. So that's going to be tonight.
Brilliant. So I think what we'll do is straight away get started and dive into some of the headlines that we've got from the data. So the big one there is 259 goals. So that's something to bear in mind for the kind of landscape of what we looked at. 72% of the goals were from open play, leaving 28% set play goals. We've then got at the top there just an idea of right foot, left foot headers. We will unpack a little bit more finishing types as we go on, but yeah, just some overall headlines just to give an idea of what we're looking at. This is very much surface level data. You can see the majority of the goals, for example, are scored inside the box from open play, and then we've also added a little bit of an appreciation in terms of how quickly the data can move, how quickly trends in the game can move, especially in the women's game. So we've had an appreciation of even this season. You know, we've only just finished the data collection for last season, but already it's moving on. Already are we seeing trends change? There's certainly a lot more goals in the women's, in the WSL, and probably an awful lot more in the men's game as well from this season to last. So there's certainly some different things going on with the data. But just again, as a caveat to that, if you focus just in on that red box, every piece of data you see tonight throughout the webinar will be from those open play goals. So what we've almost done is we've tidied the data a little bit, because we wouldn't feel confident saying this many goals were scored inside the box or outside the box if we were using every different type of goal. For example, if we were to use penalties, it would skew the data a little bit from where the shot locations were and the type of finish and things like that. So what we're doing is we're using 187 open play goals, which is just the percentage from that 259. So just to give you an idea, really, as we go on throughout the webinar. So this, if we think of shot location for the goals that were scored of these 187, we've split it into the 5 lanes, which we talk about quite a lot within the FA's philosophy of play. We talk about pitch up into 5 lanes, and as you can see, it's heavily weighted towards the middle lane. This is where the shots came from for those open play goals. And it's just an illustration of where that's happened. So, guys, straight away, is there anything that's coming to mind there for both of you?
Yeah, I think from my perspective there, Simon, I think linking in nicely to the webinar we previously did with some of this data attached to it, which was the final third, finishing the attack webinar we did with Bev and Rianne. And a lot of that was looking at the strategies in order to enter the final third, and how do we utilise team principles to get into the final third? What's your methods? How structured or unstructured are your methods? How much do you rely on some sort of structure to allow players to, I suppose, get into the key areas that you want them to get into based on their individual capabilities? So if you're looking at that now, you're starting to think about, how do I get my final action to be in lane 3? And how am I going to utilise the players I've got in order to allow my final action to be in lane 3? And I know that sounds quite obvious, really, that we want to get in front of goal to score goals. But if you think about the amount of time, us as even from a national team perspective, we spend in lane 5 on the right-hand side, and we've seen a large showcase of that in the World Cup. That do we or do teams usually spend too much time in lanes 1 and 5? How direct are we? Can we try and stay in lane 3? Do we have to go out to come back in? And these are all the different questions now that start to pop up around how do we get that final action to be in lane 3? And starting to probably tie in some data with the national teams and the World Cup. There was a lot of focus and data done around that, and they found that the quicker the ball went from front to back, so from building the attack into the final third, the more likely that was to result in a goal and a goal scoring opportunity. So if you're thinking about, can we get in lane 3 and stay in lane 3, quickest route, how do we get there? And the technical proficiencies the players will need in order to do that. So they're the types of things running through my head, really, but just looking at that as a real simple picture.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting as well, because we sort of alluded to earlier around trends in the game changing a little bit, and already this season we're starting to see more goals scored in that box. Again, that data may change as the season goes on, but it's an interesting point to think about. And then again, as Kelsey said, in terms of where those deliveries are coming from, and where are those final balls coming into the box, or what are those chances being created, where are they coming from? And looking at the data from the lanes, again, we can see that predominantly that's coming from that middle area, and those goals are coming from that lane 3 as opposed to out wide, which again has probably changed over the course of the recent seasons.
Yeah, sure. I think people have already started to allude to it in the chat, and it's really I think that's the assists is where the context is, and as we go along, we'll try and layer the data in. What we didn't want to do is put a million different numbers and all sorts on the screen for you to digest at the start. We're almost going to build it in. So the assists, you will see the assist areas, but it's a fantastic observation just initially before we've even got into anything else. So again, yes, Kelsey, you've spoken about getting into these zones, and I think that's really important. I think you have to relate all of this to the game, because that's an easy thing to kind of see and get your head around. But obviously, the closer you get to the goal, that the goal is in that central area. Mm-hmm. And I think is the best teams will play where they want on the pitch and impose their game style on the opposition. So are they really comfortable in lanes 1 and 5, or do they get into lane 3 and try and stay in lane 3 and penetrate that way rather than go wide, put crosses in? So I think that's a really good observation from both of you there. So what we're now doing is we're now taking another step forward with the data. So we looked at it in the 5 lanes, which was quite a general perspective. We're now grouping the zones into a little bit more detail. I'm going to bring you guys straight in again on this, just to give me your initial feedback and maybe preempt what other people might be thinking within the chat.
Yeah, no problem. I think for me, the shot location there, and I think data is really, really useful to start to really unpick what the game is telling us, where the game's currently at, what's it telling us. I think there's obviously a few things to consider around teams that scored the goals. So your Man Cities, your Arsenals, your Chelseas that score the most goals. What's their style of play? And that will probably start to come out in some of the data. And if you can see there that it looks like that second 6-yard box is really dominant. And again, taking that out of context, you're starting to think about, how a team's getting there. What does that look like? What does the final ball, the final action look like? The key action prior to that shot that allows us to get opportunities within that second 6-yard box. And where will the balls come from predominantly in order to allow us to be in there? And you're starting to think about the amount of bodies that would be in and around that area, from the opposition's perspective. How many bodies would they have? What would that look like? What's the amount of time I would have to take the shot to analyse the goalkeeper? How many touches would I be allowed inside that area? So I'm starting to now bring in some context of the game into those zones and starting to think about it in a little bit more detail and think, even there in your lanes 2 and 4, you've still got a small percentage. If you add them up, you've still got 9% of goals coming from there as well. So it's interesting to see the location and actually that 38% there, that second 6-yard box being the most dominant and not the one inside the 6, which, you would expect from looking at previous seasons' data. So.
Yeah, and again, I think with that as well, probably linking back in to the previous webinar you spoke about earlier, you sort of spoke about in there how 59% of goals were scored with one touch. And again, you're sort of averaging between 2 and 3 players in the way. So linking into your practice and thinking about how you sort of build your practice around that and think about the realism to the game and the relevance to the game. It's about building the practice to replicate those scenarios and take your players and put them in a realistic sort of scenario that we're going to see come out in a game to help them build those proficiencies in those areas and develop their strengths and plug those development gaps that the players might have in those areas.
Yeah, and I think linking it back to our topic of practice design, we're starting to think about what would the practices look like from those areas. Would it be an isolated practice? Would we have those bodies in the way? And I suppose that what we start to look at and unpick in a lot of detail when we do coach development is around the real clear objectives and outcomes of the session. What is it that we're going after? Why have we chose that area of the pitch to go after? Why have we chose that many bodies? What's the outcome? What's the purpose? Why am I doing what I'm doing across the 4 corners? And it might just be a psych element. It could be a physical element about that box, because you think about the bodies and how to utilise my body in particular to block runs, get across the front shoulder of the defender, those types of finishes where it might be a physical element I'm having to go after. And balls coming in, where are the balls coming from? Because that will completely change my technical proficiency that I need, whether it's a movement pattern, whether it's allowing the ball across my body, the timing of the run, all those elements will come into play when trying to finish in that area. So I think having those real clear objectives are really, really important.
Absolutely. And I think you're both absolutely right to keep practice design in the forefront of your minds throughout most things you do, but also, more importantly, tonight on the webinar when interpreting the data. So that takes us nicely into this next picture. So what we've done is we've plotted the shot area on the left, but then where the assists are coming from as well. So you're now seeing a different picture. You're now seeing the darker greens potentially in another area. That's up for you to interpret. But I think the key thing here is, does that then affect, knowing where the assists have come from, does that then affect the kind of practices that you'd put on?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important to take it into consideration. Again, with all this, it's the sort of caveat in terms of interpreting data that's specific to your players and to your team. So, if you're analysing data for your team and you're finding that actually, as we can see there, for example, on this one, the assists, a big percentage coming from just near the halfway line or even in your own half. So are our practices reflecting that? Are we starting practices from our own half, or quite often are we just going to that sort of the cross and the finish or the ball across the box? Are we starting our practices from areas that are realistic to what we're seeing come out in the data?
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that final action piece as well, like what is the most common final action prior to that? Is it the long ball? Is it the through ball? Is it a ball beyond? How many players does it go through prior to getting there? And from analysing the data and doing that, you can tell that your Arsenal's, Chelsea's, they had the most key actions prior to it because they had a bit of a build up. And you suggest that Chelsea are quite direct at times, and they try and go as close to route one as possible through the correct sources, but they did utilise quite a lot when needed, key actions prior to goals. So it's really interesting to see if you was to add that onto the key actions and who was placed where and how many key actions were prior to that assist. That would then be interesting to think about, again, practice design and how that might affect the practices I do with players, especially finishing practices.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as well. Again, we sort of had a look at the data, and there was one piece around sort of 40% of goals coming from a regain. So whether that regain is you sort of regaining possession, and there might be several actions after that point. But in practices, how often are we sort of building that into the practice? Is it something that's worth considering in terms of bringing that out and making it more game realistic so that you can set up your practices with that regain? Maybe that's where your practice can start from. Yeah. And I think that's something important to consider as well.
Yeah, it's a really important consideration. I think, when you think of a finishing drill, which is what we're the main thing we're talking about tonight, really, almost those finishing drills. But a traditional one would be, I don't know, a crossing and finishing, maybe with cutbacks in as well. Lots of high amounts of repetition, but are the players making decisions? Are they actually doing that enough in the game, or is it other things? So we rightly identified, 19% from those around the halfway line there, just on the right hand side. Yeah. Do we see enough finishing drills or transitional practices, phases of play that start from there? That would be something to bear in mind, I think, as a coach. And again, it's what do the assists look like? Definitely, and that's something you've both rightly identified, that's probably different throughout the teams. Here, we're simply talking about the league as a whole. Mm. So we've put that up there. This is something that we've spoken about, but this is something we're urging you to have a consideration for as well.
Yeah, I think perhaps something we sort of missed on that one as well is in terms of perhaps taking it back a stage. If you actually consider sort of where your team might be creating a lot of chances, what sort of percentage of those are being finished? So again, is this something we can do in training to support our players in that development of those areas? So again, if a ball's coming over the top and we're finding that a lot of the time that's being delivered and it's getting to the final action, and the final action is then not a conversion of the chance into a goal, isolating those areas and then being able to work with them, with our players, with those individual players around their individual player plans as well, is something to think about.
Yeah, I think even adding on to that as well, Adam, is like the percentage around how much do you do on the bits that you're already good at. Yeah. So if this was just a team, and we're talking about, this is Man City's data as an example, and you're talking 38% of the goals are coming from there, how much do we continue to do that and perfect that versus how much do we try and get into those other zones that might sneak us the extra goal, might give us a different model to our game plan. We might be able to go round a little bit more, which might stretch the back line and allow us in somewhere else. Because obviously teams will do the research and know some patterns that might come out. It's never really predictable, but there is some patterns that might come out. So it's starting to think about how many different strings to the bow can we do without watering down and diluting the quality of how we do that. So there's always that to and fro between how much do we continue to get better at what we do versus increase what we can do.
I think that's a great observation. I think it almost depends on the time you've got as well. If you're looking for a quick win, you might be looking at the chances you're already creating because they're taking care of themselves. Yeah. How do we increase the the success rates of the chances we're already getting. Whereas if you've got a little bit more time, maybe the start of pre-season, you then look to maybe adapt where your weaknesses are or perceived weaknesses are. So yeah, I think it maybe comes down to just the time you've got as well. If you've got to win the next 3 games, you know, different coaches are in different situations in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's definitely different for performance versus development. So up until this point, we've considered the WSL last season as a whole and all of the open play goals that are scored in there. So what we're going to do now is consider the individual. And it's going to be now focusing a little bit more in terms of the 2 finalists of the upcoming Women's FA Cup on November the 1st. So this is the kind of case study we've got. We're looking at Chloe Kelly, who obviously last season played for Everton and was their top goal scorer with 9 goals in 11 league games. She's now moved to Man City and she's made a good start with 3 goals in 5 league games already. So what we'll do is we'll just play a video first and foremost before we go into any more detail. So a nice short video, just 3 goals there, 2 from Everton and 1 when she's now been playing for Man City. So have you guys got any observations of those goals or considering the individual at this point?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just looking at the different types of techniques, really. The backlift that she has, the amount of touches she has, where she shifts the ball in terms of that final touch prior to finishing, and starting to think about how do we replicate that for players and how do we get players to find their own identity around how they do that. I think there was a lovely piece in the Man City versus Chelsea game and the penalty, and that they were speaking around the technique of the penalty, and there was a little hop and a little jump prior to the finish, and that was just a little muscle memory type of exercise that's done just to try and get into that foot patterning, the swing, the lift needed, where it needs to go, the finish, and we need to consider whereabouts in the goal do we need to finish in order for it to be the most successful it could be past the goalkeepers as well. So starting to think about how can we promote that in our players, and support them on that journey, support them on trying to figure it out themselves, but having practices that will allow them to do that, and supporting them with that journey, and starting to think about, do we know what technical actions are the most proficient? How do we support them with that? And I think, you know, people that I've worked with in the past will know that I'm quite big on the symptom versus cause piece, that we might see a player, let's just say, not be able to do ball coming across from lanes 1 and 5, across the body with a first time finish. They really struggle with that. And we might just have to continue to do that with them and keep thinking, we'll just keep doing that and they'll get used to it. But it might be a physical aspect. It might be that they just can't get their foot patterning right. They take an extra step. They're not moving quick enough in relation to the trigger of the ball, the timing of the ball, the movement of the ball, the speed of the ball. So are we just replicating something that's just going to get the same action? Are we starting to really unpick the cause of what's going on, to help really define what this technical action looks like, and what is the most proficient technical action from specific areas of the pitch? And you can see there that Chloe Kelly's clearly start to think about what that looks like from a wide area and come in inside and being able to finish that far post. So she's obviously been thinking about that and the technical action and having opportunities to practice that as well in sessions.
Yeah, I think that sort of brings on an interesting point as well, though. So obviously we look at Chloe Kelly having left Everton and gone to Man City, and what sort of implications that has on the team in terms of how they adapt their practice. Do they adapt their practice actually, and do they continue to do the same sort of practices that they've been doing in the hope that they've identified those areas that they want to be strong in and they want to play in a certain way or a certain style? Or does the recruitment change that? Do players coming in start to affect that practice design a little bit, and do they start to then focus on the individual strengths of potentially players who potentially play in a different way?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that, isn't it, around the recruitment side. Man City have obviously recruited Chloe. But then if you look at Everton's stats this year, I think it was 21 goals in total they scored last year. And we're 5 game weeks in and they've scored 14.
And it's come from a lot of different goal scorers as well, we noticed. So the goals were starting to be shared. So they've obviously adapted well, and potentially it is a little bit around that. They may have changed the style slightly. They might have approached the game in a little bit of a different way, but it's been successful. So it just kind of goes to show again that the data is for you to analyse for your own team, but also there's not sort of that one size fits all approach in terms of, one thing brings you success. There are loads of ways to do things, and it's about utilising the individual strength of your players in your environment to get those outcomes out on a game day.
Yeah, and I suppose as well it's around how different teams, managers, coaches utilise different characteristics as well of players, how they utilise that within the game plans and strategies, and what that looks like. Where do we want them to be? How do we maximise their strengths and what they come with? Chloe's obviously been bought for a reason, so how do we maximise that and get her those opportunities more often? And how do we, again, it's that how much do we work on what she's good at versus, how much do we continue to improve, knowing that teams are going to start to think about getting pressure on quickly, stopping the shot from distance, etc. So, yes, it's interesting.
Definitely. I think the consideration of an individual going from one team and potentially being a big miss for Everton. Adam, you've rightly brought it up. I think they've had 8 different goal scorers in the first 5 games, Everton. So they're not missing maybe as much as people anticipated so early on in the season. So have they adapted their practices? Does their whole style of play look different, or is it just trying to get different people into different situations? And then as well, Kelsey, you drilled down into the real technical detail, which is, again, what we want people to think about. The data will tell some of the story, but for me, it's a starting point for further interrogation rather than let's finish our conclusions at the data. I think the data is there to then go back and review the video, go back and talk to the player, go back and watch training or a game with a different set of eyes.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important because there's a million different techniques, but the techniques will bring us nicely into this. We've got the 2 different. We've got Everton now and then Man City in the slide afterwards. So the 2 finalists for the FA Cup. So what we've done is we've presented the league data to yourselves, and now we're just looking at 2 teams as a case study. We'll ask you to kind of think of Chloe Kelly as well and keep her in your mind as the individual. But as a team, what kind of implications are you seeing there just from Everton straight away?
I guess, again, we can see that sort of dependency again on that central lane. So we're looking at the goal locations. Again, there's a huge amount of percentage of goals coming from inside the box. So when we're thinking about that practice design, again, Kelsey alluded to this earlier, are we focusing on getting into those areas and how we get into them, and start to really dial down on that technical detail to get the balls into those areas, because we know that we score in those areas. So Everton are obviously proficient in getting goals in that central area of the box. So do their session practices reflect that in terms of the sort of repetition of building that? And probably the 8% that comes out are probably those Chloe Kelly goals, actually, in terms of the players that have got that ability and technical proficiency to do something different and score from outside the box, and have got the technique to do that as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how you can see that from a league perspective, Everton didn't score lots of goals, as we know. So if you're looking at that 31%, you're thinking they had to get closer to goal in order to be successful. Is that a downfall for them, that they're having to get closer and closer and having to almost unpick and get past the defenders, blocks, low blocks, etc., in order to get into that 31% area. Obviously doesn't take into consideration where shots were missed from. These are just the goals. But if you think about the 8% there compared to the league, and when we talked about the league being 38% and Everton actually being 8% of goals in there, you're thinking, is that where chances are missed? Is that where they're not potentially utilising that area as much as other teams are and being successful with? It seems to be that they're skipping that a little bit out with the 31 and then the 23. But then again, you've got to add that into the location, the assist location. So you can see there that there's quite a bit of a dominance on that left-hand side. Whether that's a little bit deeper, so that there's the cross, which might link in. And again, we're just making assumptions here because we're not linking every goal to a video and unpicking that with the data. But the 17% there with on the left-hand side as a crossing type opportunity versus then the 31 that's inside the 6. The types of balls that could potentially be, players meeting that, what those runs and balls might look like. And I think that 17 deeper one in lane 2 is quite interesting of what type of pass that might be from that area.
Yeah.
Do we start practices from that area? What does that look like in order to get us into that second 6-yard box or inside the 6-yard box by the looks of Everton there?
Definitely. And we in the chat, there's some really good discussion going on about maybe how you tactically use wingers or wide players as inverted wingers. So are there going to be more, that 17% from the assists a little bit deeper in that inverted winger channel there from the left-hand side where they utilised Chloe Kelly last season? You'd start to hope as a manager, if you were implementing a strategy, you would start to see the zones build up from what you were training and what your sessions look like. You would hope, of course, you want to score all types of goals, and you're never going to turn down goals. But is it that the better teams who score more goals actually have higher levels of repetition in what they're doing?
Yeah.
In a way, they're more predictable. Our Man City's. Let's move on to Man City now. There's an awful lot of goals there, 48%, that have been scored in that second 6-yard box. They scored more goals last season. There's no getting away from that. But their goals seem to be a little bit less sporadic, a little bit maybe more predictable. You can see they've got heavily weighted down the right-hand side, which is the opposite to Everton. It's interesting from the assist point of view. But with Man City scoring more goals, they actually were potentially more predictable with their play. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, whatever it looks like, whatever they were doing in training or the super strengths of their front players were actually habits.
Yeah, and we speak about a lot, don't we, the repetition without repetition. So how do we get consistent, repeated actions, but different contexts, different balls, different pressure being applied, whether that's direct, indirect, different bodies in the way. So is it a shot packing of 1, 2, 3? What does that look like for the player, look and feel like? Are we doing isolated practices versus fully opposed practices? What's the balance of that? And I think it goes back to, again, the subjective, like, what's the outcome? What are we going after? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And what's the best method in order to allow the player to develop in that area? I think as well, if you look at the Man City in their own half versus Everton, so Man City's low assists 7% versus Everton's none. So again, is it that Everton are doing more and trying to utilise the ball more and having more passes and having more key actions, whereas Man City are trying to be a little bit more direct at times, which, it's not necessarily saying that that's the long ball. It could be a fantastic through ball. It could be a diagonal passing behind. We're seeing all sorts of things happening at the minute. But again, Man City utilising different ways of getting the ball in behind for those players and getting the balls into those areas versus Everton potentially not so much.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, probably another link back to the previous webinar on finishing the attack as well. I know you sort of spoke about ringing the box a little bit as well, and the sort of data here suggests again that, potentially Man City are a little bit more comfortable to sort of build that possession in and around the box as well and move that ball around in there. And again, it's down to those individual strengths of the players. Everton might approach the game differently because their players dictate that, and that they can approach the game differently. They can approach the attacks differently because the finishers might look different. Whereas to Man City, it might be beneficial for them to build that possession and get those sort of one-touch finishers in and around the box, as opposed to approaching it from a different way.
Yeah, and Kelsey, how much do you think potentially how teams set up against Man City traditionally, how much of a bearing do you think does that have on where their assists are coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about, if you was a team outside of Chelsea and Arsenal, you would suggest that you'd think about a good defensive strategy against a team like Man City, who manipulate the ball very well, can move the ball through channels, through zones very well, penetrate through the lines very well. They've recruited very well over summer. So you start to think about now, teams might sit into that mid to low block. They might not high press. So that 7% there might come from that transition of they've attacked us, we get the ball, we turn them over really quickly to stop them becoming into that block, so that then we've got to manipulate the ball more. So you can see the deeper crosses there, the 11% and 4% being a little bit deeper, and it coming that earlier cross coming a little bit more than the likes of Everton utilising those areas. So again, the strategies that teams are going to employ against you will absolutely, differ what the outcome's going to be. But again, how can we put on some tactical problems and challenges for players to solve in practices? So it's not just we're going to play a game, the ball's coming in from here, we look to finish or isolate practice. We start to think about manipulating the opposition to, can you get direct pressure on? Can you drop off? Can you arrive on first touch? Can you be patient? And really manipulate those challenges for the player on the ball, to really start to think about, what action do I need? How many touches do I need? Can the ball come across my body? Can it not? The amount of time that the ball will need to travel from the left, across my left shoulder onto the right, for me then to hit that on my right foot. I might not have the opportunity, especially in that 48% zone of Man City's. It might have to be a left finish, even though I'm right footer. So really starting to consider both sides and utilising both sides technically.
Yeah, absolutely. So up until this point, we've considered shot location data, so where the goals are coming from and where the assists are coming from. That's only one layer of what we've collected. We've collected a lots of data, and hopefully you'll be exposed to that in the coming weeks and months. But as this is the first time we've presented anything, we wanted to kind of just drip feed it in. So we've got shot location data, but we've also looked at type of finish as well against shot location data, and we've looked at number of touches. So we've got a video for you here just to bring to life, hopefully, a little bit of the data collection and present some stats through video. So hopefully that's brought to life how the data was collected. And from that video, we can see the top 4 types of finish in terms of the frequency they occurred in the WSL that season. So you can see that a strike, something we've defined as almost using your laces, 35% of goals come from that. Again, using your instep, almost a passing finish is 31%, volley 14%, and a header 12%. So without unpacking that too much, we just wanted to illustrate the point that different techniques occur in sometimes different areas of the pitch. So, for example, if you're working on a volley, do we see lots of volleys from outside the box? You know, it might be the first thing you think of when you think of a volley. Have a look where headers are more commonly scored, passing it into the net or striking it. So, yeah, again, we just wanted to illustrate that point of the variation between the different types of finish. Adam, would that come into your thinking with setting up a finishing practice?
Yeah, 100%. I think this is somewhere where, the data can be really informative in the sense that if it is specific to your players and you can get hold of that data for the players in your club, because the more we start to understand what strikes are successful or what finishes are successful, so whether that be a strike, instep, volley, header, and what areas those are happening on the pitch, we can start to manipulate our practices to get those outcomes out. So we can start to, put together practices that give the players opportunities to either improve their proficiencies in those areas or to test and challenge them and improve them in the areas that they need to be improved in. So yeah, I think it's really, really important when we're designing those practices to make sure there's a real variance of those finishers, but also making sure that we're putting our players, under the pressure that's game realistic as well. So if we're saying that, for example, an instep finish, when we're talking about there being a lot of players in front of the box, can we make sure that when we're putting our practice together, we're considering that there are going to be defenders in the way, considering what type of ball's coming into the box, what our delivery is, and how that affects the type of finish that we're going to see as well.
Yeah, again, I think that's where you go to the video. We saw 3 of Chloe Kelly's goals, and they were similar, but no 2 goals were ever made the same. So yes, we can look at the data in some depth. That should be the starting block, I think, for that. We'll move on to the number of touches, because this is also another technical stat which we measured when considering the types of goals in the WSL. So you can see there just from the offset, first time finishes, it's heavily weighted towards them. Over half of every goal in open play was from a first time finish. Again, does training look like this? Do your finishing drills look like it? Are your games set up to get these returns out of it? And do they look like similar area sizes?
Yeah.
So we're now just going to move on to applying these things that we've seen throughout the webinar into practice, into our daily coaching, setting up sessions and planning for sessions. Also how we review them as well. Kelsey, I'll hand that over to you.
Yeah, no problem. So I think just thinking about the practice really, and without context of players, my players, what this looks like for the environment they're competing weekly. Just using this data alone, you can see that the first time finish inside that little square and the strike, if you kind of like overlay the 2 together, you can see that strike being the most predominant type of technique, and first time you can see that clear line come up around that second 6-yard box, so that the squares that sit just outside the 6-yard box across there, and starting to think about that's the type of area you can get into first time, and the strike action seems to be the most predominant. And over there, laying that with the goal location, I think is really important. So where a goal's going in, and I think someone's rightly put on the chat box as well around, seem to be on the video quite a lot going down to the left-hand side of the goalkeepers. Will completely depend on whether the ball's coming in from the left, the right, if the striker's left-footed, right-footed. But as you can see there, it seems to be that those corners and as we preach anyways as coaches, trying to hit the bottom corners, can we hit the corners? But starting to think about how you do that, and again the physical aspect of doing that for a female player, the ball coming in and being able to open my hips up to be able to instep or strike to the furthest post is a lot different of a technique than it is for a male player. So it's really starting to think about how much time do we give to that, and how much do we involve the MDT in supporting us with that, not just in the practice but around the practice and off the practice in gym work, etc. So those are the things that came into my head, just kind of looking at those and pulling those out, starting to think about how could we do that in practice. So if this was my team, again, having that real specific focus around the outcome being developing first time finishing within the second 6-yard box, utilising a lone striker. Now, Everton utilised a 4-2-3-1 for majority of their goals in the latter end of the season. So I predominantly just started to think about what would that look like as a lone striker compared to having two or having the three in a 4-3-3. How might that look different? How might the service look different? How might the technique then be different? So I started to think about what are my team principles, and how might I apply those principles to allow me to get into zone 3 on my final action in zone 3. So I just started to think about, what could those team principles be, and everyone will have their own. How can I utilise those to get my final action in zone 3, lane 3? And then a bit of a success criteria that I'm not necessarily saying that we're only successful if this occurs, but what would be my blue sky thinking? What do I want to try and achieve with the players I've got in order to maximise the opportunities to score goals? So thinking about a quick turnover and transition being the first point. If I can get 2 bodies in there inside that second 6-yard box, or at least between the 6-yard box and the second, 2 bodies on a quick transition, great. That's going to really increase my chances of getting a goal scoring opportunity. If we're in control possession, can I get 3? Because I've got more time to get bodies in there. And that third point of just the creation of first time finishing opportunities from lanes 2, 3 and 4. So the type of pass, the type of ball have to be considered. The physical aspects will have to be considered, and how we go about doing that. So just start to think about unpicking the data, unpicking what I've seen, to try and think about how do I apply my team principles. What would success look like for me and my players in that area? Especially with it being that single striker, how can I utilise adding all these things together to then try and get practice? And I started to think about, if you see the G that's currently in there in front of goal, that's where the most goals are scored for Everton. So choosing Everton in particular. The assists, where the A's are, and where the assists the most from. And as we pointed out earlier, there's literally no assists from in our own half. So utilising that, I can now see on the pitch, where are we currently doing okay? Where are we not, and maybe need to add to it in order to increase our opportunities of breaking down the opposition. And you can see there that second 6-yard box is 8% for Everton, but 38% for the league. So how can we maximise getting the ball into those areas with a first-time finish? And again, I've just started to think about some real clear questions of the who. Who do I want to get in there? Who's my 2 bodies in particular? Utilising my principles, who might they be? Do the players understand who it might be and why? Where on the pitch? So what will the entry points be into that second 6-yard box? Where are the balls coming from? And that's going to really affect my what, the technical proficiency. Is the ball coming from behind me? Is it coming from in front of me? Is it coming from directly at the side of me? Where are these balls coming from to allow me to technically apply a first-time finish? Because that's going to be really important in that area. And the when. So what moment am I trying to recreate? And I think this is what came up on the chat box around the unopposed versus opposed, the isolated practices versus practices that have defenders in chaos. And I just need to be really clear about what do I want to recreate? What part of this do I need to recreate, going back to that symptom and cause? Am I really, really clear and sure that I'm not just doing lots of symptoms again and I'm not actually fixing the cause? So that's why I need to really start to unpick that. I suppose the reason why I haven't put a session on here is the fact that this is going to look different for everybody. I could put a session on there that would mean nothing to 90% of the people watching. So I think just some things to consider is always useful. And thinking about this data here is really important. So unpicking all the WSL data from last year, this is where possession starts from. So how many times do we consider starting possession from transition? How much is it from us feeding in wave practices, feeding in from the side, spare players feeding across, crossing tight finishes that are not necessarily from deep, they're from in front. So starting to think about how often do we do transitional practices, from what areas, throw-ins, how often do we start practices from throw-ins, because that's a large percentage, corners and free kicks. So how much do we start to think about that possession starting in that attacking third? And obviously we've just chose the attacking third here and not necessarily looked at the middle or the defensive third, which could throw up some different challenges in itself. But just starting to think about how that can affect the type of practice I put on and where the balls start from. What types of players do I need? How many players do I need? What players do I need in the practice? When do I just take the 9 and 10? When do I do it isolated? When do I need others in order to allow me to support the game demands, which would be the transition, the throw-ins, corners, etc., and the implications that then has. And I suppose the key messages for me, just kind of pulling it all together, was how can you digest the landscape of the game that it currently is in its current form, but not forgetting the future and where it's going and how it might change and adapt. And I was having this conversation earlier on the A-License call was around the future of the game, and you know, we've got a duty of care to serve the players for the future of the game as well and where it might go. So what technical proficiencies might they need? You're looking at Leah Williamson now and how, you know, type of player she is, and the balls that she can hit over distance and the diagonal balls she can hit over distance and how she can hit balls over the top. And if you looked at the Jordan Nobbs type finish from the volley, what that type of technique now looks like, it's just ever evolving and changing. So how can we unpick what we already know, but not sort of forget about where it could go, to create those real relevant practices with real clarity and purpose? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Number 2, there's about how can I connect the players to the game by recreating realistic final third demands. And I think we've gone really heavy on the technical here. And Thursday night will be a great caveat to this around the defending and how many bodies are in the way, what's the type of pressure, where are bodies. If I get so many bodies in the way, what does that result in then in shot impact, and how much then that decreases the likelihood of me scoring a goal? That's going to be really important. So how can I make it real for the player? And how can I design the practice to allow the repetition, but without repetition? Repetition of those final actions. So if I want it to be a first time finish in that second 6-yard box, it can't just be the same ball coming in. Same ball comes in, pull back, 6-yard, second 6-yard finish. Because as we know from the data, the game doesn't look like that anymore. So we need to start thinking about repetition of the action without repetition of the context in which it's served up in. So how do I serve this up for my players is a question. What do your players need? What are they currently good at? And where might you need to enhance those technical proficiencies to aid a larger game model to increase your likelihood of scoring goals? And that was me just kind of summarising all the points from the data and starting to think about, as from a coaching perspective, what that means to me. I don't know, Adam, if that means anything different to you or anything to add.
No, I think again, it's just that sort of common theme throughout as well of making sure that it's specific to your environment and really considering, whilst we've spoken about tons of data tonight, and it's really, really informative, and it helps to really sort of dial into that technical detail and understand a lot about where we're creating chances, where goals are being scored, but considering the individual proficiencies of your players and or how you would like your team to look like, how you want your team to play, what is the identity of your team, and what can you do as a coach to make your players as successful as possible at executing your game plan, at executing your philosophy and identity on a match day. Yeah, that's what I would say for that, really.
Great, guys. Thank you. Some excellent insight there. So we've just brought Suey Smith on camera to just run through the last slide. This is just for everyone on the call, really, just to show how we can further support you within your own environment.
Yeah, again, those that have been on the chat box for me tonight, thank you very much for your input. Hopefully, all the answers have been kind of given throughout the presentation. But there's certainly some more support that you as coaches can dive into. So following this, you're never alone. As you can see, we've got 22 coach developers across the women and girls game. That's certainly there to help you. More recently, in the last couple of months, the FA have recruited 8 women and girls coach development officers. So they're going to be placed within regions of the county FA, support women and girls moving forward for the next 4 years, as well as the numbers that are above that have been in place for the last few years. So that the NCDs and the Women High Performance Centre Coach Development Officers. So on the field as such, whether you're grassroots to talented to the elite game, you've got some real support there that can help you and ultimately help the players that you work with as well. So thank you very much for this evening and your input throughout.
Yeah, thanks, Suey. Yeah, just before we go, you guys have rightly alluded to it already. We have got the second instalment of our 4-part series in the leading up to the Women's FA Cup final. That's on Thursday at 6 p.m. And again, we're going to flip the lens slightly, look at the goal data, but from the defensive point of view, how many players are in the box, how many players are trying to block the shot, amongst other things as well. So yeah, we will direct you that. It will be recorded and available on YouTube afterwards, as will this one. So if you think there's anyone who might have missed tonight, then please do direct them to the YouTube link. But yeah, again, from all of us, really, thank you very much for your time tonight, logging on and being part of the ongoing conversation. Again, thank you, and hopefully we'll see you soon.